Hello, this is your brain on drugs. This is a punk rock psychiatrist. All right, so that was The Science of Myth by Screeching Weasel. What always say it's one of my favorite bands. I don't put bands on here that are not one of my favorites. So I picked The Science of Myth. It's basically it's like a critique of religion and kind of how people think about it differently. That's what the song's about. But like I chose it because it had the word science in it, and we're going to talk about some science today. I've been telling you all about like what I think you should eat and what you shouldn't eat and what's good for you and what's not, and what foods I recommend you eat more of and which ones you should eat less at. And we've been focusing a lot on obesity and metabolic health and weight and stuff like that. Well, today, as promised, I'm going to give you the scientific evidence that we have currently, and this is the best evidence that I can find, with a connection between eating kind of the way that I've been suggesting and mental health. And so, you know, I really care about weight. Everyone cares about weight, but this is a mental health podcast, and like, food is medicine, right? And why is a psychiatrist talking about this? Well, because I'm a physician and I care about health, but it's also because this affects your mental health. And so like I think we haven't really gotten into that yet at this point, like too deeply, where I've actually shown you what eating better can actually not just improve like your health span and your lifespan, but also improve your mental health. All right. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And I wanted to start off with something I think is some super cool information. Um, we're talking about diet and mood, and we're looking at the number needed to treat for a certain treatment modality to help with depression. Okay. So, for those of you that aren't aware, number needed to treat is kind of like, say you've got a medicine and it's like, oh, this helps resolve this issue in 50% of people. And there's a number needed to treat of, whatever. I don't, that 50% is going to be equivalent to something. And there's some math that goes into that. But let's just say it's four, right? So that means that we would need to treat four patients to get one better. And you may be thinking, wow, that's crappy odds. But that's actually pretty good. Like a lot of our mental health medications, the number needed to treat is like 8, 10, 12, which isn't great. But at the same time, it's like, well, we're not going to find that one patient if we don't treat the 10, right? And there's one person that's really going to get better. And that's just for this one treatment modality. That doesn't mean that the other nine patients can't be healed. It just means that, like, when we tested this particular treatment or this drug with patients with this condition, we had to treat 10 people for one to have resolution of symptoms. Now, that also means that some of those patients probably got some benefit. They just didn't get their symptoms resolved, right? They didn't recover from their issue, but they got some improvement, right? So there's a little bit lost in that as well. Okay, so the lower the number needed to treat, the better the treatment. Like if you had a number needed to treat of one, which doesn't exist, there's nothing where every single person is going to respond to a treatment. But like if you that's what basically what that would mean. A number needed to treat of one would be for every one person you treat, every one person gets better, right? So you can't get better than one. One would be like the highest, and you would never reach one. So like two would be like basically the best you could possibly imagine. Okay. And so let's look at what the number needed to treat when we're treating depression with different treatment modalities is. So we're looking at antidepressants, which we know, um, I always say aren't great, but like, here's the thing about antidepressants. If you're a primary care doctor, you probably think antidepressants are pretty darn good. And if you're a psychiatrist, unless you're delusional, you probably think they're pretty darn not good, right? And that's because they actually are pretty decent. Like when you look at the Star D trial, what was it like? Close to 70% of patients had resolution of symptoms. But like I think in the psychiatry world, we don't see that. That's because most patients see their PCM first, and those patients are getting put on meds, and they're working. And those are the patients that tolerate the meds. Those are the patients that get better. Those are the patients that stay on these medications for years and do great and do fine with their meds. It's the ones we see are the ones that have already failed two, three, four treatments. And so, like, what is the point of us giving them another antidepressant, you know, another SSRI, unless whoever gave them the ones before was doing a really crappy job of like dosing and timing and stuff like that. There's not much we can do. We need to go for something a little bit different, right? And so, like, that's the challenge for psychiatrists. Like, I think when we're dealing with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, we're getting a lot better results because we're treating those patients from day one. But for our depressed and anxious patients, those patients are seeing their PCM. And so, like, I think that's another reason why we might not see the antidepressants as being as effective. Because when you look at effect sizes and things, it's actually pretty similar to like our other treatments. It's just that we're treating our bipolar patient the first time they get sick because other people are not prescribing lithium. Only we're prescribing lithium. And so, like, we get to see the patient's first reaction to the meds, and we get to see patients get better. But like I said, with depression, anxiety, they've already kind of the easy to treat patients have already been seen. And so, like, those end up being our tougher patients. So antidepressants actually aren't that bad. It's just like if you're a psychiatrist, I think you need to be a lot more like hesitant about how effective these are going to be because the people you're seeing probably are the ones that they're not going to be as likely to work for because they've already tried them. All right. So antidepressants, number needed to treat 7 to 9. That's not a terrible range. It may sound terrible to those that are thinking about, man, upwards of 9 people just to get one that, is healed from their condition. Um, yeah. But like I said, you give a different med and then patients that didn't work with the one could work, and then you could get like some benefit for some of those other patients, just not as much as we'd want. So 7 and 9, not terrible, not fantastic either. All right. Our next most effective treatment, TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation. Pretty good, pretty good. Number needed to treat 6. All right. Um, Also, keep in mind, people that take TMS have probably failed like 4 or 5 drugs. All right. So these are people that have not only been the initial people that failed antidepressants, they've also failed a few more. And so 6 for like these harder to treat patients, not bad, because we're dealing with the tougher to treat patients here. And out of every 6, we get one. I mean, that's pretty decent, especially considering that we're treating hard to treat patients than we were with antidepressants. Now let's look at nutrition. So this is diet changes. This is what I'm talking about today and what I've been talking about. Number needed to treat 4. All right. That's from just one trial. That's from the SMILES trial, which we're going to talk about. It's 67 people. So like this is not as much data to get that 4, but it does kind of underscore, wow, nutritional changes can make a huge difference. All right. And then I can do you one better. Exercise. Number needed to treat 2. Wow. Um, why and why do you think doctors are always telling people to exercise and improve their diet? Right? I mean, this is why. A number needed to treat of 2 and 4, it beats TMS, beats everything. These are the most effective things. That's why I'm doing this kind of obesity medicine, lifestyle psychiatry series, because not only should this be your first line treatment, this should be like you should be doing this while you're doing the other stuff as well. This is the most effective stuff. Diet and exercise. That's how you fix pretty much everything. And it's like, I don't know, like I often tell you, I travel a lot around the world, and I was just in the Middle East. And so I get to observe another culture and another diet and another, just way of life of the way people are there. And, they are a bit more obese in that part of the world than in a lot of other parts. Almost, in many respects, rivaling the United States. And a lot of that has to do with the same factors. Um, they've got a lot of wealth. Now, I went to several countries. I went to some wealthy countries like United Arab Emirates. I went to Oman. I went to Saudi Arabia. These are like wealthier, oil-rich countries. And I went to Jordan, which is kind of a medium country. It's not poor. Syria and Lebanon, Syria and Yemen are the poorest countries in the region, with Jordan and Lebanon, um, and Iraq being kind of in the middle. And those other countries I mentioned, with Israel, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait being the wealthier nations. And like, you can see the difference. Wealthier nations tend to have more obesity because they don't have to work as hard. They don't have to move around as much. They don't have to work as hard for their food. They have more plenty. And wow, in Riyadh, holy cow, they have a lot of American chain food restaurants. Wow, they do. Like, they have American chains there that I've never seen outside the United States, and that I've not seen in some states in the United States. I'm like, they have a Cane's Chicken? Like, really? They've got Five Guys. They've got a Cold Cold Stone Creamery. I mean, they have every chain restaurant of their own and of the US that I've ever seen. It's absolutely insane. There's no In and Out or Whataburger for fans of those places. And I know I am a healthy food advocate, but I'm sorry. I do occasionally like some In and Out, some Whataburger. Sorry. Um, but yeah, just the number of like chain restaurants. And then here's the other factor. It's really freaking hot. Like, up in Jordan, it doesn't get quite as it's not as hot as down in the Arabian Peninsula, but it's hot there, and so like, you can't go outside hardly at all, and so it's hard to get exercise and get outdoors and things like that. And so, but it's at the same time, I'm still not seeing the level of obesity there that I see in the United States. Just and it's something, it's kind of like Europe. It's like, do they have more obese people? Yes, they do. Morbidly obese people, though, nobody beats the United States. For, I mean, other than maybe Pacific Island nations, um, you just don't see the levels of just absolute, like, very, very high levels of BMI as you do in the United States. And like, I have to attribute that to nutrition. And like I said, when I'm looking at the Middle East, I'm seeing all these chain restaurants in particularly Saudi Arabia, more than anywhere else. Oman, much less so. The UAE, yes, a lot. Jordan, almost non-existent. And these were thinner people, healthier looking people. So I think diet is such a huge factor, right? And it's a huge factor in mental health. Like, what countries have like some of the worst mental health? America, some of the worst. And I think this nutrition and exercise is just a huge factor in that. And then, like, there was another thing I learned about recently, just to keep going off on tangents here just for a second. Um, when thinking about like fortifying foods with vitamins and minerals, and we're so obsessed with supplementation in America. Our food is already supplemented. Rice is supplemented. Grains, flour, cereals, they're all supplemented. And they like went overboard on this because they discovered some like nutritional deficiencies like 100 years ago. And I kind of think about like this idea that, like, when you supplement unhealthy food with things like that, you lose the craving for the healthy unprocessed or foods, right? And if you don't have all this stuff in that unhealthy food, then maybe you're not going to want it as much, and you're not going to get so unhealthy from it, and you might eat more vegetables and you might eat more healthy foods. There's countries like Japan and France that they don't fortify their food, and they're not getting, people with like pellagra and stuff like this that have like vitamin B deficiencies, because people eat more healthy foods, so they're not getting like all this supplementation. So I just think all this ultra processing and things that we do, and all these fast foods and things, that is just such a huge factor, not just in obesity but in mental health as well. And so let's dig into some of the, science papers on how nutrition can help with mental health. So I'm going to start with the Sun study from 2009. This is one of the earliest studies. So this is a study by Sanchez Villegas et al., entitled Association of the Mediterranean Diet Pattern with the Incidence of Depression. The I can't read it. So this is just the University of Navarra follow-up Sun cohort. So I think this was done in like Spain or something like that. All right, 2009. So it tested the hypothesis that the Mediterranean diet, which we've talked about, right? Like this is kind of the diet that I've been advocating for: whole grains, no, no, minimal ultra processed foods, uh, seafood that's got like omega 3s in it, um, lower amounts of meat. We've got cheeses and dairies in this diet as well, um, and then we've got lots of fruits and vegetables and things, right? It's interesting. I actually saw a study today that said that there was an association with eating high fat cheeses and some sort of health factor that they didn't see in like low fat cheeses. And it's like, and we were just talking about saturated fat in our last food episode, right? A lot of saturated fat in that fatty cheese. It's actually good for you. I mean, I saw something on bread today. Um, the bread, we're so afraid of bread because it's got the gluten and it's got like all the carbs in it and stuff. And even if it's whole wheat, but this like really naturally properly made bread that's going to be bad in like 1 to 3 days is actually good for us, right? I mean, in the Middle East, they eat a lot of bread. That's actually where wheat comes from. It comes from the Middle East. So that is their grain. And so it's not an unhealthy grain. We just make it unhealthy. Okay? So that's the Mediterranean diet. And so they test this hypothesis: the Mediterranean diet improves inflammatory, vascular, and metabolic pathways linked to the development of depression. They took 10,094 university graduates who were not initially depressed, and they mailed them a 136 item food frequency questionnaire. And they wanted to see what the incident. So these are people that were not depressed at the time they sent them this initial study. And then they wanted to see what the incidence of depression was, either diagnosed or, so they determined whether they were depressed 4.4 years later on whether they had received a diagnosis of depression or they had been prescribed an antidepressant. All right. So these are people not initially depressed, and they're like, I don't know, early 20s, 4.4 years later. Did they have this diagnosis? And then they also like rated how adherent they were to these like Mediterranean diet guidelines based on a 136 item food questionnaire that they took both before and after. All right. And so they divided them into 5 groups based on how much they adhered to the diet, right? There was the lowest, low, medium, high, and highest, right? And so the low basically didn't, this is like the 20% that didn't like adhere to the Mediterranean diet at all. And the low would be like this is the next 20%. So the 20 to 40% that adhered a little bit to it, all the way up. And they did hazard ratios. With the lowest group was like a 1. So basically like no difference in like depression incidence. But then when you looked at the next group up of adherence, the hazard ratio was 0.74. So that basically what that means is that like they had like a 26% less incidence of getting depression if they were like even slightly adherent to the Mediterranean diet over those that were not adherent at all. And then you had a hazard ratio of 6.6 for the next group, 4.9 for the next group, and oddly 0.66, 0.49, and 0.58. So interestingly, it was the second highest adherence group actually had more reduction more decreased risk of depression, a 51% decreased risk of depression over the highest group. But still, the highest group did better than the third highest group. So there was still, like, oddly, like, it was the ones that were the second most adherent um, group that did the best. And so I don't know, maybe that's why we shouldn't have extremes and take things to the absolute maximum. I don't know about that, but still the top two groups were the most, they had the least risk of depression. All right, so largest, and then they saw the largest improvements in those with increased fruits, nuts, high MUFA, that monounsaturated fatty acids like olive oil, and fish in moderation. All right, so that was the Sun Study 2009. And then let's get to the Granddaddy trial was our next one, the Smiles trial, 2017. This was done by Felice Jacka. She's in Australia. She's like a researcher of psychology and things, and she's like kind of the godmother of nutritional psychiatry. I love listening to her talk about stuff. I've learned so much from her. She did a trial dubbed the Smiles trial, and it was like, the title in the paper is a randomized controlled trial of dietary improvement for adults with major depression in BMC medicine, 2017. So it was conducted to find out what the effects food has on moderate to severe depression, because this is something that really hadn't been tested. They often test these alternative treatments on mild and sometimes mild to moderate symptoms, but they were testing moderate to severe depression. They did a 12-week trial. They had 67 participants, which may not sound a lot, which is actually like really hard to do. So that's actually pretty good. They were randomized to control. The control group had 7 sessions of, in quotes, befriending protocol. So they had kind of like counseling. Like, they basically had someone they talked to, but the person did not give them nutritional advice. That's the control group. That's how they tried to have a control group. They still met with them and talked to them, but the intervention group had 7 sessions of nutritional counseling and mindful eating. All right. And they were counseled to have the Mediterranean style diet, whole grains, vegetables, fruits, legumes, low fat, unsweetened dairy, raw and unsalted nuts, lean red meat, chicken, eggs, olive oil, reduced sugar, and processed foods. That's what they were advised to do. Both groups started with a poor diet, identified using a dietary screening tool. So we started with people that already had a poor diet, and they already were moderate to severe depression. And when they used the MADRS score for depression, and then the results are pretty fantastic. So there was, for remission, remember, remission is like you're not depressed, 32.3% remission in the dietary intervention group versus 8% remission for the intervention versus for the placebo group. That's a pretty big difference. When we look at medications, we don't typically see this big of a difference between placebo and drug. The MADRS score, the depression scale score, decreased 7.1 points in the diet group compared to control. And the Cohen's D, which is kind of like that effect size, was minus 1.16. Holy crap. I mean, like, medications are like around 0.3. To have over 1, and remember that minus just means the symptoms went down. So you don't have to really think about the minus. Think about that 1.16. That's higher than that's like TMS, ECT, like levels, or even higher, right? So like that's like TMS, ECT levels just for diet. No more needed to treat 4.1. That was where I got that from when I said earlier in the show. Interestingly, they didn't see any weight loss. Just so their moods improved, but their weight, they in these 12 weeks, they didn't, even though they improved their diet. Like, it's hard to lose weight, right? It's really hard to lose weight. And that's why, eventually we're going to talk about the weight loss drugs, because even if you do all this diet and exercise stuff, your main benefit you're going to get is health. But are you going to lose weight? That's tough. All right. So we're going to talk more about how to lose weight later. Typically with these, I've been talking about these diet and exercise things, or the diet things, for so long, but we really only see maybe upwards of 5% weight loss when people do this. And it's just not as much as people want, and then they give up. But like, you have to consider, like, your health is improved, and look at mental health. on depression scale, 1.16. Effect size, number needed to treat at 4.1. That's insane. Um, you just can't beat that. And the thing is, this is only one trial. And it's hard to do these trials. And especially it's hard to do a trial like this. Who's sponsoring this? Who's paying for this? Who's benefiting from this? You're not going to have a drug company paying for this. You're not going to have a food industry paying for this. It's tough to do these. And so like that's why this is such a spectacular trial. It's one of my favorite trials that exists out there at all. I love this trial. Let's talk about the actual changes that the participants made. So like we advised them to make changes. Did they even make the changes? So what did they do? So on average, this is the intervention group, increase their whole grains by 1.2 servings a day, increase fruit by 0.46 servings a day, increase dairy by 0.56 servings a day, increase olive oil by 0.42 servings a day, increase legumes by 0.2 servings a day, increase fish by 0.16 servings a day, and which honestly doesn't sound like that much, but they decreased unhealthy foods. So these like the ultra processed things by 3.11 servings a day. And that's, to me, this is the biggest key. You're decreasing your unhealthy foods and you're getting an effect size of 1.16. Spectacular. This is, and so like, if you've been tuning into all of this stuff to this time because you wanted to lose weight and maybe you've been doing it as I've been talking about it and it's been months and you're like, I'm not losing weight. Do you feel better? This trial says that there's a darn good chance you would, but still number needed to treat a 4. And that's for remission. So that's pretty incredible. Let's talk about another trial. Let's talk about the HealthaMed trial, 2019. So this is a trial entitled A Mediterranean-Style Diet Intervention Supplemented with Fish Oil Improves Diet Quality and Mental Health in People with Depression, a randomized controlled trial. So this is another pretty good trial, pretty recent, 2019. Mediterranean diet supplemented with fish oil. Depression improved by 45% versus 26.8% in the social group. So that's kind of like that befriending group we talked about in the control and the other one. So they basically just kind of like talk to people, but they didn't like give them the advice of the Mediterranean diet, and they didn't give them the fish oil. So that's a 1.68 fold difference in improvement. It was still sustained 6 months later, and the improvement was correlated to increased Mediterranean diet score and nuts and vegetable diversity. So they were eating more nuts and more vegetables. And they saw a correlation between an increase in EPA, because remember, we're also supplementing fish oil here, an increase in EPA, which is one of the omega-3s, right? There was a decrease in anxiety and stress. An increase in DHA was correlated with a decrease in stress and negative emotions, and a decrease in arachidonic acid, which is like one of those like inflammatory omega-6s, controversial ones we talked about last episode, had an overall increased quality of life. And they've got a nice little bar chart here showing like these improvements and then sustaining them. So more evidence for the Mediterranean diet, and got a couple more studies here. So here's one from 2022. It's the AMEND study, AMMEND. This one is, the title was The Effect of the Mediterranean Diet on the Symptoms of Depression in Young Males. The AMEND, so I think that AMEND stands for something to do with like Mediterranean and men's and something like that, right? I think the men in there is men and D is depression. So it's like maybe AMEND is like a Mediterranean men's depression or diet or something like that. A Mediterranean diet in men with depression. Okay, that's what it is. A Mediterranean diet in men with depression. A randomized control trial from the American Journal of Nutrition, 2022. So this is a 12-week parallel group. Parallel means that you've got, two arms, got, a control and intervention. Open label, randomized controlled trial assessing effects of the Mediterranean diet on moderate to severe depression in young males. And they looked at the Beck Depression Inventory compared to placebo, and there was a change of 14.4 points. which is kind of a lot. That's a huge scale increase. I mean, like you have a drug that like has maybe like a 3 point improvement over placebo and it gets approved by the FDA. And we're looking here at a 14.4 points. That's like an insane difference. You don't see that with psychiatric drugs. Okay. Quality of life difference, 12.7 point difference. It's just really massive, right? And like, so if you didn't trust like the Smiles trial, like we have more trials, all right, like, and they're all showing like really big differences. And here's another one. This one, Francis et al. A brief diet intervention can reduce symptoms of depression in young adults, a randomized controlled trial from 2019. So, 2019 study on young adults with a Mediterranean like diet showed an effect size of their recommended diet versus the habitual diet, which would be like what they were eating before, um, on depression. And the effect size they saw was 0.65 to 0.75. So, not quite as good as the 1.16 we saw in the Smiles trial, but still like substantially better than any medication, like 2 to 3 times better. Got a couple more studies here. 2011 Predimed Navarra study. This is actually a study done by the same folks that did the Sun study in 2009. So by Sanchez Villegas et al. The effects of the Mediterranean diet on plasma brain-derived neurotrophic factor levels. Um, so they were just like in this study, this is 2011. They were just trying to see like what effects does a Mediterranean diet with nuts have on. I don't know why you say with nuts. I feel like the Mediterranean diet should include nuts. What effect does that have on BDNF, the brain-derived neurotrophic factor? Like that's the stuff that helps the brain grow, like better, healthier, mentally healthy connections. And like what effect does it have on BDNF in depressed patients? And I don't have the numbers for this one, unfortunately, but it saw it. There was basically eating this better diet increases your BDNF. Okay, which should lead to less depression. So um, it's another positive piece of information there, and kind of like also like an explanation for like why is this working? Like why might this be working? Like if it's increasing BDNF, that could be an explanation for like why it's helping with depression. Because you might be thinking, why is diet like even like having an effect on depression? Like I think you might think, yeah, I understand that makes sense, but like mechanistically, what's going on? And this may be like some of what's going on, increasing BDNF. And then here's another study, 2013 meta-analysis by Saltapolu. Sorry, I can't pronounce that. Looks like Greek or something. Mediterranean diet, stroke, cognitive impairment, and depression. A meta-analysis from the Annals of Neurology, 2013. So this is actually a meta-analysis, which is like that's a study where that's a basically it's not a study, but it's where they pool like a whole bunch of other studies together. So we have like more numbers. So we like have more assurance that like things are accurate, because sometimes you can look at like individual studies and they might look a certain way, but then when you pool all that information together you get a different answer. So these meta-analyses are like really great. So because like the Smiles trial, oh, it's just 67 patients, it's just one trial. Well, here's a meta-analysis of 22 studies um, on the Mediterranean diet, and so it showed those with high adherence to the Mediterranean diet was consistently associated with reduced risk for stroke, with a risk reduction of zero point 0.6 or 0.71. And so basically that means like there's like a 29% reduced risk of stroke, and then depression 0.68. So that's like a 32% decreased risk of depression. and cognitive impairment of zero point 0.6. So that's like a 40% decreased risk of cognitive impairment, which is like dementia, Alzheimer's, things like that. And so here we're seeing like, across the board, Mediterranean diet, decreased risk of stroke. And I mean, if you're having decreased risk of stroke, like that's decreased risk of cardiovascular disease. That's like less risk of like heart attacks and all on these other things, right? And then decreased risk of depression, and and interestingly, the decreased risk of depression, there was actually a more of a decreased risk of depression than there was cardiovascular disease with the improved diet. So like I think we all think about like, diet helps our physical health, and like we don't really think about our mental health, and that's why I like doing today's episode. um, but it actually had a bigger effect on depression in this meta-analysis, a bigger effect on depression than it had on a cardiovascular um, disorder like stroke, and then an even bigger effect on cognitive impairment. So that's really interesting to me. And so, we've covered several studies here. It's only been 35 minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and plug through the rest of my scientific studies for like these were the ones for depression. I was going to break this up, but 35 minutes, not very long. We'll go ahead and hit the rest of this. So let's look at some other mental health conditions. So here's a study for borderline personality disorder and omega 3s. I actually already mentioned this when we talked about omega 3s, but I wanted to like throw it in here, from Karazuska et al. Marine omega 3 fatty acid supplementation for borderline personality disorder, a meta analysis, Journal of Clinical Psychiatry 2021. So it was a meta analysis combining 5 randomized controlled trials comparing omega 3 fatty acids to placebo or active comparator, effect size, overall borderline personality disorder severity. So the effect size on the severity of or borderline personality disorder was 0.54. Affect dysregulation, so that's like something that people with borderline personality have, where affect dysregulation is basically like they can't maintain a stable mood. They go from like high to low, and like they switch their moods a lot. Effect size 0.74. Impulsive behavior 0.45. So um, and, and then they looked at cognitive perceptual symptoms, and they didn't see any difference with the omega-3 fatty acid supplementation with that. But like these effect sizes are pretty huge, and they're better than like there's no drug approved for borderline personality disorder, which basically means they don't work, even though these patients end up on a truckload of them. And they end up on a truckload of them because they don't work. And so what does work? Omega-3 fatty acids. So, maybe eating more fish or even taking the supplement could help with borderline personality disorder. Um, it's pretty substantial. This beats antidepressant antipsychotics, as did food on depression also beat medications. Let's look at ADHD. Um, I think I may have talked about this one in the ADHD series, or I'm going to. I can't remember if I already covered this. So 2011 meta-analysis of omega-3 fatty acids for ADHD. Effect sizes range from 0.3 to zero point 0.5 with a high EPA. Yeah, I think I did talk about these because when I was talking about the alternative treatments before we started talking about medications. 2021 meta-analysis of 9 studies for iron and zinc supplementation. They didn't see as much benefit for that, especially because they said that, especially in the US, people are just not deficient in those. And then they did a 2021 study on the DASH diet, which is kind of similar to a Mediterranean diet. It's the dietary approaches to stop hypertension diet, but it's fruit, vegetables, fish, whole grains, nuts, beans, very similar Mediterranean diet. But it's also low in sodium, which, I'm not like big on. But it also avoids sugar, salt, saturated fats, cholesterol, refined grains, and also I'm not into like avoiding cholesterol either or saturated fats, but that's what the DASH diet is. Um, I don't necessarily think it's bad to do that, but I also don't think you need to do that. But overall, this is still a fairly healthy diet if you want to follow it. So they compared controls, so those on the DASH diets had a significant improvements on multiple parent, teacher, and child rated measures for ADHD after 3 months. Also, there was more pro-social behavior and few conduct problems. And pro-social behavior essentially means like they were interacting with peers in like a healthier way. So we're seeing here diet. We saw these studies. Diet helps with depression. It can help with, specifically it was omega 3s for borderline personality disorder. And now we're looking at ADHD, some dietary things, some healthy diet can help with ADHD, both omega 3s and the like kind of dash, which is similar to a Mediterranean diet. Um, Here's another one for ADHD. I have not talked about this one yet in the ADHD series, but I'm going to get to it. So this is a new one, 2025. I may have mentioned this in one of the update episodes, though. 2025 Danish registry study. So those are those cool Scandinavian studies where we have like tons and tons of participants. 60,000 mother-child pairs assessed at age, and then the children were assessed at age 10. Um, and basically, what they did was they assessed the mother's diet while she was pregnant, and then they looked at the children 10 years later. And because we have all this data in these countries, because they collect this, they're able to like look back and see this. So they looked at a Western dietary pattern during pregnancy, and they saw that it was associated with neurodevelopmental disorders in childhood and adolescence. So there was a significant association with ADHD and autism diagnoses. Um, Moderate shifts along this dietary pattern spectrum associated with 66 increased risk of ADHD and 122% increased risk of autism. Oh my gosh. Not only does Tylenol cause autism, but the Western dietary pattern causes autism. We've found the cause of autism yet again. No, um, but I think you certainly can see there's that correlation between like Tylenol usage and autism, which, remember not to say that you should not take Tylenol during pregnancy if you need it, because if you need it, the risk of taking it is actually, the risk of not taking it would be worse, right? But if you don't need it, there may be some increased risk there that we're not entirely sure about. And there's some things that have said, actually, this is not the case. Um, and then here we have another one. Diet, Western diet could increase your risk of autism. So don't eat at McDonald's when you're pregnant, right? So they saw diets that were high in fat, sugar, and refined products, and low in fish, vegetables, and fruit had the strongest association. Also, in early pregnancy, had a stronger association with increased risk of ADHD and autism. Let's talk about cognitive functioning. We already mentioned that one study, but we've got more. 2007 study on rats. Let's see, this is effects of chronic stress on hippocampal morphology and function, an evaluation of chronic restraint paradigms. 2007 study on rats. Chronic psychological stress caused. So they basically they stress the rats out, and there's different ways of doing this. They basically like put them in water and they can't get out. Things like that caused hippocampal, and the hippocampus is where our memory is where a lot of our memory is stored. Hippocampal dependent cognitive deficits, decreased dendrites. So they had decreased dendrites. Those are the projections off of our neurons. Having less dendrites is typically bad. After 21 days in rats restrained in metal wire. So they were not in the water. They were restrained in wire, 6 hours per day for 21 days. So for 6 hours a day for 21 days, these rats were like restrained with metal wire, and they had decreased dendrites in their hippocampus, and which caused cognitive deficits. Okay. Um, so basically what we're seeing here is that stress is making cognitive functioning better. This doesn't really have anything to do with diet here. This next one does. 2011 study of court rulings and snack hour. So judges were found to be more lenient when they were well fed. This is like a famous study. It's hilarious. Basically, if you go before the judge right before lunch or right before the end of the day, you're more likely to get a bad outcome than if you are seen right after lunch. Not a great thing for our justice system. Basically, like, if the judge is hungry, they're more likely to give you a bad ruling. Not great. But this is like subconscious also. Um, This next study, a couple of studies actually, a Mediterranean diet, still talking about cognitive functioning, Mediterranean diet associated with better cognitive functioning, lower rates of cognitive decline, and reduced Alzheimer's disease. This is a study called Mediterranean Diet, Cognitive Function, and Dementia, a systematic review, from the journal Epidemiology 2013. And then this next one, um, from Adherence to Mediterranean Diet and Subjective Cognitive Function in Men from the European Journal of Epidemiology 2017, showed a highest adherence to diet, like a healthy diet, correlated with lower odds of poor self-reported subjective cognitive functioning with an odds ratio of 0.64. So that's like 36% better. That's like they thought that their cognitive functioning was better compared, like basically they adhered to like a good diet versus they didn't. Um, and then a whole bunch more on cognitive functioning. Let's just roll through these. 2008 study of 449 people followed for 21 years showed high saturated fat diets associated with poor global cognitive functioning, prospective memory, executive functioning, motor speed compared to polyunsaturated fat diets. So here's, I was talking about how I didn't really think that saturated fats were that bad. Here's a study that shows, remember, monounsaturated, those are seed oils. So folks that had seed oil versus saturated fat diets, better cognitive functioning. Here's another one, 2012 study of 6,183 nurses studied over 5 years with serial cognitive testing showed those with high saturated fat diets had more significant cognitive decline compared to those with high monounsaturated fat diets, and that's olive oil. Next one, 2015 cohort study from 40 countries, a total of 27,860 participants, followed for 56 months. That's like what, like 5-6 years, about 5 years, showed that those eating the most nuts, veggies, fruit, fish higher relative to meat and eggs, and whole grains high in fiber had lower rates of cognitive decline with a hazard ratio of 0.76. So that's like 34% less, for those on the healthiest foods versus the least healthy foods. So several studies on improved cognitive functioning with healthier diets. And then we've got a whole bunch on omega-3s. 2008 animal study showed higher omega-3s diet had better working memory and reference memory. 2012 meta-analysis found that high omega-3 intake helped with cognitive impairment but not dementia with attention processing speeds and immediate recall. 2013 study of children aged 7 to 9 with lower DHA and EPA in their blood had a small associated poor reading ability and working memory performance. 2022 study of 1,416 patients in France found that those who had fish weekly had decreased incidence of developing dementia over 7 years of follow-up with a hazard ratio of 0.66. I think I talked about all those on the omega-3 episode. And then here's a little bit more. Diet and cognitive functioning. Avoiding a high sugar diet. So high fat and refined sugar diet in rats had decreased BDNF. Remember, we want BDNF, and decreased neuroplasticity. That we want more neuroplasticity. So the high fat and refined sugar diet had decreased BDNF. And here's a 2012 study following, and also, I mean, we don't necessarily know if this high fat was the problem because it's high fat and refined sugar, right? So, high fat may not be that bad for us. Is it the high fat? Is it the refined sugar? Is it both? Next study, 2012, followed 937 subjects for 3.7 years, found that those in the highest grouping for total carbohydrate and sugar had almost double the risk for developing cognitive impairment, whereas those with a high protein or fat had lower risk. All right. So that kind of rounds out all my studies. It's a ton of studies. I threw all the cognitive functioning in there just because I wanted to show you all the things that diet can be beneficial for. So we see benefit in cognitive functioning, Alzheimer's, dementia. We see benefits with ADHD. We see benefits in borderline personality disorder. And we see benefits in mood, right? So a lot of studies, A lot of those are really great studies. A lot of them, like, they're pretty good numbers, high number of participants, and it's just pretty consistent across the board that eating a diet that's generally kind of how I've been advising improves all these different aspects of your brain health. All right. So, wow, got through a lot of stuff there. Now you have some evidence to back up a lot of the diet advice I've been giving you. And next time, what we're going to talk about are barriers to healthy eating. Okay. So this is basically like, I've been trying to help you explain to you what to eat better. And I think a lot of folks know, they don't necessarily know. And that's why I wanted to detail it. But next time, we're going to talk about why people aren't doing it. And if you can identify exactly what the problems are, we can then identify how to overcome that. So I think you're going to find that really helpful. So, like, when you're saying, oh, this patient is basically giving me this excuse, how do we counteract that? How do we get over the challenge? They're saying, oh, it's too expensive. Oh, it's this. Oh, it's that. How do we say, well, you can still do it, and this is how. That's what I'm going to talk about next time. So I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you will join me next time, and I will see you then.